Good morning. Can you hear me? Very good. So welcome to this plenary session of the last morning. My name is Eva Kisti, and it is my privilege to introduce the speaker of this morning, Hisashi Ohtsuki. He started his career and got his PhD from the Kyushu University in Japan, and then spent some time at Harvard University, and then now he is back to Japan as professor at Sokendai University. And what I really would like to tell you about him is his very wide range of interests. Only I can't, because it probably would take up the whole hour, and it wouldn't be a good exchange for his talk. So just let me say this much. It spans from the origin of life to cancer modeling, with pearls on the way, like a recent paper on the question, why are emotions contagious? So why do we like to laugh together? Why do we like to enjoy nice conferences together? Is it adaptive? Is it shaped by evolution? It's very nice to think that it is. But then his main interest is in game theory, and he has made an enormous impact with his work on games on graphs, that is, games on social networks, relaxing the classical assumption of game theory that populations are well mixed. Of course, we are not well mixed. We have a complicated social structure, social network. So we learned a lot more about how we ourselves play games with each other and against each other from his work on games on graphs. And today, it is more like playing with each other on the question of cooperation. Why do we help each other? Now, this is, of course, a long-standing question in game theory, and everybody knows tit for tat. I help you because you have helped me, and by helping you, I hope to secure your help in the future. If I don't help you now, you will retaliate and will not help me in the future. The problem is that this often does not explain actually anything, because we don't interact with the same person so often to play tit for tat meaningfully. So we have to pull back on indirect reciprocity, the idea that I help you now because by helping you, I maintain a good reputation of being a nice guy. So therefore, in the future, others will help me because they will know that I'm worthy of help. So help the good ones. That sounds straightforward. But of course it is not, because who are the good ones? We need a good definition for goodness or niceness. Obviously, a good guy is a guy who helps. But if he helps a criminal, is he still a good guy? So a precise definition is very important here, and this precise definition is a social norm. And obviously there are very many, really zillions of possible social norms, and it's very exciting and very challenging to navigate the labyrinth of social norms, which takes us straight to today's talk, Let 1,000 of Norms Bloom by Hisashi Ohtsuki.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? No? No? That's a problem. Yep. How about? No. How about now? Okay. Okay. Thanks for your cooperation. I'll talk about cooperation, so give me a moment. How about that? Okay. Okay. It sounds good. So thank you, Eva, for a nice introduction, and thank you very much for local organizers including Professor Marcus Owen for a fantastic job to organize the conference. And my thanks also goes to ESMTB and SMB board members and scientific committee members to give me such a wonderful opportunity here. Sorry. So today I talk about my recent works on evolution of cooperation. Especially I have humans in mind, so I talk about human cooperation, and I talk about how the evolution itself has shaped our moral judgment, as ever kindly mentioned in her introduction. Okay, so let's start. Okay, so indirect reciprocity is one of the mechanisms that sustain cooperation, especially that's quite important in humans. So here's a schematic diagram. So at least 3 persons must be involved in that system. So here's a guy A, and A helps B, usually at the sacrifice of his cost, energy, time, something, to give the benefit to individual B. And in indirect reciprocity, there must be a third party who observes either directly or indirectly the behavior of A. And because A has cooperated with the guy B, so she, in later time, helps A. By this way, the cost that A has paid is compensated by the individual C. And if this chain goes on, the cooperation is sustained. So it's called indirect reciprocity. As you may know, there are 2 main mechanisms in reciprocity. One is direct reciprocity, and the other is indirect reciprocity. So those two instances of reciprocity are both equally important to our social life, especially in our daily, kind of helping cooperation behavior. In direct reciprocity, usually we assume 2 individuals, I and my friend, for example, and I help my friend, and my friend some days later will help me back. So that's the dyadic interaction, and by so doing, you can establish a cooperative relationship with your friend, with your partner. In that case, you have to rely on your personal experience of what your partner did to you. For example, your partner was really, really helpful, so because of that, I help him back, or so. So the personal experience is quite important, and as you know, a famous tit-for-tat strategy that cooperates only with a person who cooperated with me works quite well. But in indirect reciprocity, the situation is a little bit different, and we mainly talk about a large-scale cooperation, not a dyadic cooperation. So we tend to consider a kind of a large group, a group of size 10 or 100 or even 1,000, and people are interacting with each other. And sometimes, or quite often, those who you meet are strangers. So you do not know so much about the partner. So you have no experience, for example, with that partner. But still, you want to try to cooperate or not to cooperate, depending on the social information. And for that case, the social information such as reputation or gossips or rumors are quite important, because you listen to some, gossips, information, reputation about that person, and accordingly you change your behavior. You will cooperate with him or not. So Richard Alexander was the first who systematically and formally mentioned the mechanism called indirect reciprocity. And he thinks that the indirect reciprocity is a consequence of direct reciprocity. So his idea is that the people are engaged in many dyadic interactions with your friends, with your colleagues or so, but that is extended to indirect reciprocity in a sense that you do some behavior, you do some social interactions in front of people, like I'm speaking in front of you, and you evaluate me with some good or bad reputation. So those interested audiences play a critical role in indirect reciprocity, because they evaluate your behavior, and in future you will receive or not receive cooperation depending on the reputation you got at that time. Well, so there are a lot of experimental studies showing that the people love to talk about, about third parties. So there's a quite interesting experiment conducted by Dunbar and his colleagues and he or his team eavesdropped, for example, in a British cafeteria, what people are talking about, and also inside the British train, they eavesdropped what they are talking about. They make a paper on what they talked about, and surprisingly, 2/3 of the human conversation, our conversation, is about others. So that interesting study tells us how people love talking about others. And a recent study by anthropologist Polly Wisner clarified that this kind of 2/3 rule also holds for hunter-gatherer society. For example, she went to Botswana to then study the conversation content of Kum Bushman there, and actually she found that the Kum Bushman conversation also followed this 2/3 rule. So that's not a special example for the modern societies, but it seems this kind of tendency is a human universal one. Also, people love talking about reputation, but people care about your own reputation. So here's the quote from Othello. So Shakespeare very well know that the reputation is quite important. So the Cassio, he lost the trust from Othello, cries in deep sadness, saying that reputation, reputation, reputation. Oh, I have lost my reputation. I have lost the immortal part of myself, and what remains is bestial. So this quote says that the reputation is almost everything for you in your social life, and if you lose completely your social reputation, you are like an animal. So Shakespeare already knows the reputation is quite important. And another interesting study secretly conducted in the laboratory is the study by Bateson, 2006. And as you know, when we do research, there's a kind of tea room or relaxing lounge, and we talk and discuss with each other about your research. And there is a donation box on the table. So the donation box is for collecting money for using milk in the refrigerator, because milk is a kind of public goods, and you drink tea and coffee and talk with each other. So they volunteer, so they voluntarily donate money to the milk box. So they secretly showed those images above the donation box of the laboratory. So in odd number week, they show the image, striking image of eyes, human eyes. And in that even numbered week, they show the quite neutral image, such as a flower image. And secretly studied the rate of donation by the lab members. And the result was dramatic. When you show the image of eyes, the donation is twofold or threefold higher than the neutral image. So maybe that's a good take-home message to your laboratory, and if you cannot collect so much money, then you should show a lot of eye images to subconsciously give pressure to your colleagues. Yeah, that's a good application of indirect reciprocity anyway. So I think, people have such a tendency. So people love talking about gossiping, and also people very much care about the reputation. Maybe the Twitter is running on even for the talk today of my own, and the reputation is currently being established. But reputation is such an important aspect of social life. And I think those human tendencies to take care about reputation and also loving talking about reputation is a kind of adaptation to indirect reciprocity. As far as I know, indirect reciprocity is reported only in humans, so it's a quite human-unique phenomena. And I think our cognitive ability or linguistic abilities, especially using language, greatly helped us to use indirect reciprocity. So I think those, cognitive linguistic abilities are a very important pre-adaptation for us to use indirect reciprocity. And also, what is important in evolutionary biology and anthropology term is that indirect reciprocity explains our large-scale cooperation, even within unrelated individuals. So we usually are genetically non-related, and we are in a social group, and we cooperate with each other, and that forms the very basis of our society. So far, I have talked about some examples of indirect reciprocity, but when it comes to theory, you have to overcome a lot of questions, and you have to explain how the indirect reciprocity must have been shaped in our history. Well, so the central question that I will talk about today is the stability of indirect reciprocity. So many questions, theoretical questions arise. For example, what makes individual A to expect reciprocation from C? If A is 100% sure that he will receive cooperation in future, maybe he will help individual B. But if there are no guarantees, why? What leads individual A to cooperate with B at the sacrifice of his own cost? Or the motivation of C is also questionable. So C cooperates with A, knowing that A has done a good behavior. But why such a mechanism has evolved? So she somehow distinguishes people with using social information and preferentially cooperate with a good reputation guy. But why this kind of social tendency has evolved? And most importantly, in order to explain the evolution of cooperation, you have to explain how the social cheaters who do not cooperate with others but receive cooperation from others are excluded from the system. So a lot of theoretical questions are here, and I talk a little bit about a model part. So the seminal model was proposed by Novak and Zygmunt in 1998, and I think that is a quite basic fundamental model of indirect reciprocity. So they assume the interaction between reputation, one's reputation, and behavior. So their assumption is as follows. So for simplicity, let's assume that in our world there are two reputations only, so the binary reputation. You are either good or bad. Of course, there is some gradation in our evaluation. He's super good, he's relatively good, or he's super bad, or something like that. But let's assume that we have only binary reputation in our world. Another assumption is a random matching assumption. That is to exclude a kind of direct reciprocity, repeated interaction between two individuals. But rather, they assume that a large population, and those people, those players in the population randomly match. And assigned a role of donor and recipient. So donor is supposed to give something, and the recipient just waits for the donor to give something to him. Okay, so that's a really basic setup of the model. And how does the interaction occur between reputation and behavior? Well, a donor, as I explained, the donor can distinguish between a good reputation guy and a bad reputation guy, and can change the behavior accordingly. So let's say that the donor uses some strategy here called action rule, and the donor takes into account the reputation of the recipient. So I assume that the donor can see the reputation of the recipient, whether he is a good guy or a bad guy. That is socially determined. And then depending on the reputation of the recipient, you can choose whether you want to help him or not help him. So in the following slides, I use the game theory terminology, cooperation, or C, that is cooperation, so helping somebody at your own cost to give some positive benefit to your recipient. And I use the word defection, or D, that means not doing nothing. So you pay nothing and the recipient receives nothing. Okay, so in that framework, I assume those payoff structures. That's what you get or what you lose. If you cooperate, the donor, U, loses the cost C, but the recipient gets the benefit B. And the defection means both gains nothing. Okay. So in such a theoretical framework, we can study the competition among 4 action rules. Actually, because I assumed 2 reputations, binary reputations, and for each case you can decide whether you want to cooperate or not. So there are 2. That means 4 action rules, theoretical possibility, as a theoretical possibility. For example, the action rule named all-C strategy that always cooperates irrespective of the recipient's reputation. So you do not care about the recipient's reputation. In contrast, all-D strategy, he does not cooperate at all. So he does not look at the reputation of the recipient, and he always refuses to help others. The key strategy here is a discriminator strategy that cooperates with a good guy but does not help that guy. So our common sense tells that is our strategy, but let's see how and why and when the discriminator strategy evolves in our framework. There's the 4th strategy that's a bit counterintuitive. I name it paradoxical strategy. That does not help a good guy, but it does help a bad guy. But hereafter, I neglect this kind of paradoxical possibility. Okay, then the donor does something, and according to the donor's behavior, the donor's reputation is updated, of course, in front of interested audience. So the donor's reputation is updated according to some rule in a society, and I call it social norm. Okay, so you do something as a donor, and your reputation is updated, and that influences your future outcome. The simplest social norm is called image scoring. That was first proposed by Novak Zingmunt in their first paper, 1998. And the rule is very simple. If you cooperate with someone, then everybody evaluates you as a good guy. So you get a good reputation, okay? So you are a donor, and you cooperate, and then you get a good reputation. Or if you defect, then you get a bad reputation. That's quite simple. Okay, so they studied the interaction between reputation and behavior in this way. So they assumed 4 strategies competing with each other, and after the donor's interaction, the donor's reputation is always updated according to the social norm. Here, the social norm is image scoring. So I show you their result. So here's the simplex that represents the frequency of 3 strategies in a triangle coordinate. And each vertex represents a population that is dominated by one strategy. Okay, so here's all the vertex. So that represents that the population is dominated by all these strategy. And here, the same for all C strategy. And here's our key strategy, discriminator strategy. For example, the very center of this triangle is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That means that those 3 strategies coexist with the equal frequency. Okay, and those arrows represent how the evolutionary trajectory goes. So if you start from here, for example, there are less discriminators initially, and the vector field drives you to the OD state where nobody cooperates. So that's apparently a bad scenario. If you start from the initial state here, so the discriminators are relatively prevalent in the population, and the population goes toward one of the neutral equilibrium on the all-C and the discriminator edge. The reason why there is neutrality between all-C strategy and the discriminator strategies are that because they cooperate all the time with good guys. So if there are no bad guys, then those 2 strategies are completely neutral. So those, field circles are stable equilibrium in a Lyapunov sense, and those open circles are unstable equilibria in a Lyapunov sense. So the discriminator strategy, in this sense, has some stability, but there is some problem. Because of the neutrality on the all-C, all-D discriminator edge, so maybe some genetic drift, or the inherent cost that the discriminator pays, because discriminators have to discriminate between good guys and bad guys, whereas OC players does not care at all about the reputation of the recipient. So maybe implicitly, this model does not incorporate such a cognitive cost. But if you include such a cognitive cost, then we can expect that the neutral drift or some selective pressure occurs, and that pushes the state of the population toward the OC vertex. But once the population goes here, any perturbation to the system leads to the OD. So in that sense, discriminator strategy is stable but unstable. So that's the result. Well, so going back to the experimental thing, some researchers have studied whether this kind of image scoring evaluation is actually used by humans. So that's the first experiment run by Wedekind and Milinski, 2000. And they calculated a hypothetical image score as the integer number that is calculated as the number of copulation you did previously minus the number of defection you did. So they calculated the image score of each participant of the game and studied whether those who have an image score are likely to receive more copulation than compared with the lower scored guys. And the result supported the image scoring. As you see, those who have a higher image score than average tend to receive more copulation, and those who have a lower score tend to receive less copulation. So that is an experimental support of image scoring. But then a lot of theoretical researchers raised the problem, especially a theoretical problem in image scoring. One of the most critical criticism is about the robustness of errors. If you include some kinds of errors in the system, then the stability of discriminator strategy suddenly collapses. For example, if you assume implementation or a behavioral error that occurs with the probability epsilon that is strictly positive, and if you commit that error, although you intended to cooperate, you fail to help somebody. This sometimes happens in our real life. You prepare something, but you fail to show up, for example, or you get the code or something like that. But this kind of behavioral error, even tiny, changes the evolutionary dynamics drastically. Here you see that the edge connecting OC and the discriminator strategy is not neutral anymore, but you see a kind of polymorphism on that edge. So if you start from the top region, even if you start from the top region, you go back to one of the equilibria on that segment. And what makes matters worse is this Lyapunov stable segment is epsilon short. Epsilon is the frequency of error that we usually assume very small. So almost all the parts of this segment consist of unstable equilibria. So in that sense, the discriminator strategy is not stable evolutionarily anymore. The reason, the intuition behind this collapse is very simple. So let's suppose that there is somebody who maybe erroneously or intentionally, but anyway, Alice defected someone. And Bob observes that situation, and Bob thinks that Alice is a bad guy because she didn't cooperate. Alice is bad. So Bob would think that he would not help her. But if there is a third party who evaluates this interaction between Alice and Bob, named Chris, sees this situation, the Chris would think that Bob is a bad guy. Because remember that under image scoring, any defection is bad. So Bob did defection against Alice. So Chris thinks that Bob is a bad guy, and as a result, Chris would never help him. And this kind of infinite chain of erroneous defection continues. So that's why the discriminator strategy are not stable against the OD strategy. But that's quite counterintuitive when you think about your daily life. So apparently there must be something wrong here in that table. So image scoring assumes the defection is always bad, but is it true? So let's change this part a little bit to see how our moral judgment has been established through an evolutionary time. For that purpose, I and Yo Iwasa, who was a supervisor of me and still a wonderful collaborator, did an exhaustive search of what kind of social norm establishes and maintains stable cooperation by indirect reciprocity. Okay, so here's our idea. This table is very simple, maybe too simplistic to explain our indirect reciprocity occurring in our daily life. So why not changing this too simple social norm such that we have such a general framework describing the social norm we might have in our daily life? Well, apparently this table looks very complicated, but I'll explain to you what that means. So here's the action that the donor has taken, cooperation or defection. So that's the same as before, but I added some component on top of the table. And this table, first, you look at this row, and it says recipient equals good or recipient equals bad. So you can distinguish the situation where you cooperate with a good guy and cooperate with a bad guy. Like you helped a very good saint, you helped saint and you helped mafia, for example. Or you can also distinguish the case you did not help a good guy or you did not help a bad guy. Our common sense tells maybe those two persons should be distinguished because someone helped a good guy and someone helped a bad guy. And also I added a history-related part. So this donor equals good means that the donor was previously good or the donor was previously bad before the interaction. Maybe there is some history effect on your evaluation as a donor, so I added this component too. So for each cell, you specify either good or bad, and that makes up one table, one theoretical possibility, and that is a social norm. Okay? So for example, you write good, 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 good here and bad, 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 bad here. That's one of the theoretical possibility, but that is actually the same as image scoring as I explained, because donor's cooperation is always good and donor's defection is always bad under the image scoring social norm. But that's not necessarily the case. You can, for example, write good, bad, bad, good, good, bad, bad, good, or something. So any combination is the scope of our study. So we do not assume at all any moralistic thing in our theoretical framework. So there are in total 2 to the 8th power, that is 256. Actually, my title is 1,000 social norms. So that is 1/4 of 1,000 social norms, but please forgive me. I noticed after submitting, my title. But anyway, there are 256 social norms as a theoretical possibility. So we do not give any, bias according to our daily sense, but we study all the theoretical possibilities. So that's how the theory should do. Okay, and this part, what the donor did is sometimes called first-order information, because that's an essential component of the information when you evaluate donors' new reputation. The second component, marked in orange, is sometimes referred to as second-order information, or to whom you did that behavior. And the third-order information is your history-related thing, by whom this action was done. So we incorporate those pieces of information to make a moral judgment. And accordingly, the action rule space must be extended a little bit. Here, previously, the recipient's reputation mattered, but the donor's reputation didn't matter. But here, the donor's reputation also matters. So you are a donor, and you look at the recipient, whether the recipient is a good guy and bad guy, and you change your behavior accordingly. But also, you may take care of your own reputation. And you write C or D, and that makes up your personal strategy. For example, all the C strategy always cooperates, all D strategy always defects. And the discriminator strategy, you cooperate with a good guy and you do not with a bad guy. So here's the theoretical method. So as I explained, there are lots of theoretical possibility in social norms, but I fixed one out of 256 as a social consensus. So I assume that everybody agrees how to evaluate the donor's behavior. Okay, given this, then, as I explained, there are 16 social action rules competing, so I let those strategies compete, and with some behavioral errors and reputation assignment errors. I do not very much talk about that in detail, but I assume some kinds of error to avoid some neutrality. Then I try to look at which strategy, action rule, can be an ESS, evolutionarily stable strategy, under which social norm. So apparently, there are a lot of theoretical combinations that we have to study, 256 social norms and 16 action rules that makes 4,096 combinations. And each of them we studied. Of course, not by hand, but by some analytical techniques. But here is the result. The uninteresting thing is that all these strategies are always ESS. But that makes sense. Everybody is not cooperating in the world, and you try to invade with a cooperative strategy, but you are just neglected and you are just exploited by all these strategies. So all these strategy is always in equilibrium, but that's not what we are looking for. And we looked for other ESS combinations. And actually, we found a lot of combinations of social norms and action rule where the action rule is evolutionarily stable under that particular social norm. And here's the graph. So the y-axis is the count, and the x-axis is the level of cooperation at that stable equilibrium, at ESS. So if the level of cooperation is very high, so that's a relative value to the theoretical maximum. So that means that when the x value is close to 1, that evolutionary stable state establishes a high level of cooperation. Okay? So I changed the B over C ratio, that is the benefit-cost ratio of indirect reciprocity, cooperation, and I find that the 8 combinations persistently are a very good combination that sustains cooperation and that does not lose stability, even if B over C is very close to 1. So I and Yo named those fantastic combinations of social norms and action rule leading 8, because there are 8 good combinations. So as you see, this is the combination of the social norm. So those 5 parts must be specified, but those 3 parts are wildcards. So it can be either good or bad. And then our corresponding action rule is discriminator strategy or something similar to discriminating strategy. You cooperate with a good guy and you do not with a bad guy. Okay, so this result was quite surprising to us because we had assumed no moralistic assumptions in our model, but somehow the moral emerged out of the model. Look at those 4 cells. That says that if you cooperate with a good guy, you are deemed as a good guy. That makes sense to us. And also, if you refuse to help a good guy, you are deemed as a bad guy. That also makes sense, quite intuitive sense. But I think that our intuition, we think it's intuitive, is a product of evolution. Either genetic evolution or cultural evolution, or maybe a mixed of those 2. The other thing we find particularly interesting is the evaluation of a defection against a bad doer. So if you find a donor who defects, who does not help a recipient with a bad reputation, this leading edge social norm tells that such a behavior should be deemed good compared with bad in the previous image scoring social norm. So that pivot we named justified defection, because you do not help others, but your behavior is justified. So here's the diagram. Here's another Alice who defected recently, and Bob thinks that she is a bad guy, but she's bad, and Bob does not, or will not help her. But under the leading 8 social norm, the Chris's viewpoint is different from image scoring. Chris observes that someone refused to help a bad guy, so under the image scoring social norm, Chris should look Bob as good. And then the infinite chain of defection ends here, and the cooperation is reestablished. So this kind of notion of justified defection has the role of preventing the chain of defection from continuing more and more. Okay, so here's the experimental part, and many researchers studied whether people actually use this kind of justified defection, or more generally, the second-order information. The first few studies in 2000 that time were not supportive of our view. And for example, this research showed that people use first-order information rather than second-order information. But the authors and the researchers think maybe the information that the experimenter gave to participants were really complicated, because that person cooperated with a guy who did not cooperate or something like that. And recent studies are more supportive to the use of justified defection. For example, the second study shows that adding second-order information promotes our cooperation. And the quite recent study in Evolution and Human Behavior journal supports the view that second-order information is preferentially used by participants. So here's a graph by the Swackman et al. This year. So the x-axis represents how much cooperative the recipients, your current recipients, are. So this number represents the number of cooperation in 3 most recent interactions that the recipient had as a donor. So that tells how much the recipient were cooperative. So 1 or 2 or 3, for example, 2 means your recipient cooperated twice and defected once. Okay, so that is history. And then the experimenter gave an opportunity that the donor can ask the second-order information of the recipient of 1 of the 3 most interactions that the recipient had as a donor. So those purple bars represents the donor asked the second-order information, background information, why the recipient refused to help. And those light blue color bars represent the instances of donors asking the second-order information behind the recipient's previous cooperation. So apparently, people are more interested in why your recipient had previously refused to help others. And even if the cost is involved, so you have to pay some cost to get second-order information on the recipient, the trend was the same. So that tells the people are really eager to know the second-order information, especially why your current recipient previously refused to help someone. And recently, I and my collaborators come up with some fascinating strategy to overcome this second-order or second-order information problem. So what if the Bob, refuses to help Alice, and immediately after that, he throws the money in front of people to demonstrate that that's not genuine cheating, but he has to refuse cooperation. He has to refuse cooperation with Alice. That may work as a good strategy, and I name this intention signaling strategy. The intention signaling strategy works quite similar to the discriminator strategy, except that he sometimes abandons the money, just abandons the money in front of people as a signaling after defection for whatever reason. For example, he may have committed an error and he cannot help others. So to avoid being blamed, he throws the money. Or he does defection, but it could be a justified defection. And to show that it is not cheating, but a defection that is necessary for the society, he throws money, just throws money in front of the audience. So what is good in the intentional signaling strategy is that you don't have to care so much about the second order information, because what the intention signaling strategy player does is quite simple. He sometimes throws money or he pays the cost, and that's a sign that he's not a genuine cheater. Actually, we recently performed an evolutionary stability analysis and found that the intention signaling strategy is evolutionarily stable against OC or OD strategies under behavioral errors. So those are my collaborators. They are social psychologists. And we did also an experiment whether people actually use those intention signaling strategies or not. The two questions arose. The first question is, do people use such a signaling option if they are given such an option? And the second question is, do people help signal us more than non-signal us? So here's an experimental setup. We recruited 99 undergraduate students from the Japanese university, and the cost is set to 5 Japanese yen. That's maybe 3 pence or something. But that round is repeated 100 times, so at the end you can make money if you are really successful in that game. And the benefit is 10 Japanese yen. So every time you pay 5 Japanese yen, your recipient gets 10 Japanese yen, okay? And the error is set as, error rate is set at 10%. So that's a computer programming experiments. Everybody sits in front of the display and you push the button correlation, but they know, and we actually experimenters tell those participants that even if you push the button correlation, sometimes 10% of the chance the result of your behavior is defection. So people are sometimes really upset because they tried to push correlation, but the display says you defected, you cheated. Then you give a signaling option to those who are quite unlucky players. You can throw money in front of people. So you can just push the throwing away button and you abandon 5 Japanese yen, but that signal is sent to all players in a laboratory setting. Okay, so here's an information setting. So the donor knows the previous behavior of the recipient, whether the recipient cooperated or defected, but immediately after that he signaled, or defected and did not signal. And in showing our result, we tend to classify our result as defection against cooperation or defection against the defection plus signal player as unjustified defection, and defection against the defection plus non-signal player justified defection. Okay, so I'll show you the result, the first result. So the first question is, do people actually use signaling? The answer is yes, they actually use signaling. After the implementation error, that is quite uncomfortable error for the participants, but they actually use that option. And also after justified defection, so you find a wrongdoer and you refuse to help, and then immediately after that you abandon your money to show off to everybody that I'm not cheating, but I had a reason to refuse to help. More than the case of unjustified defection. So the first answer is yes. The second question, do people care about signaling? The answer is yes also. And here is the giving rate to a giver, and the signaling non-giver, that's D signaler, and the non-signaling non-giver, that's D non-signaler. So people took care so much about those who defected but immediately sent off the signal. So that's quite a cool experiment. Okay, so I'm running out of my time gradually, so I'll talk about 2 recent extensions of my model. So far I have assumed that there is kind of perfect consensus on social information, and the social information is such perfect that everybody can perceive everybody else's behavior. But that's not, of course, necessarily the case in the real world. So the first assumption was that everyone agrees on the reputation on the same person. So there are no private opinions. But we sometimes have the case that we have a different opinion of the same person. Okay, so how about that? Or the second limitation was that one's behavior is not always observed. Sometimes your interaction is not seen by others. What happens? Okay. So for the first part, I and Yo studied the case when how I think and how others think are different, and studied an evolutionary analysis, which is more adaptive to follow what you think and or follow what others think. And we found that following what others think is quite important in indirect reciprocity. That's a bit counterintuitive if you believe that what you're doing is right. But in indirect reciprocity interactions, the key is how others view you, not how I view myself. Because according to the reputation they have on me, they cooperate or defect. So even though I think this is the right thing, but if others think that it's not the right thing, then I should tend to follow what others think. And this has been confirmed by an experiment. That's such a quite interesting experiment. So X is a donor and A is a recipient. X knows perfectly about the past history of A. So X doesn't have to care about the second donor information or so, because X has a full set of past history information of the recipient A. But there's an option that X can see the gossip done by this gossiping third party, G. So G gossiped something positive or negative about A, and X can take into account this gossiping if he wants to. The result is remarkable. So the gray bar is the control, and if the gossiping player gives something positive on A, then the donor's behavior got more cooperative, and the opposite was true. Although X has a full access to the full information of the full history of information of A. So that tells how others think plays a critical role in our moral evaluation. So the last part, for the second part, so far I have assumed that information quality is perfect, but that means that I always assume that the situation is public and everybody sees my interaction. So with probability 1, my interaction is observed by others and my reputation is updated. But what if we deviate from this assumption? Okay, so we assume another situation called private situation. Your behavior is observed with a partial probability Q. Okay, Q is less than 1. A central question in such a system is whether the honest strategy evolves. So the honest strategy here, I mean the strategy that cooperates in public situation and private situation. Remember that in private situation, you are less likely to be observed by others. So maybe you want to try to cheat, take advantage of that possibility. So we studied a competition of 16 action norms, including honest strategy. So here the third order information, here this information is a little bit different from the previous one. So you can take into consideration the recipient's reputation, but also you notice whether your interaction is public or private. So you know whether your interaction is likely to be observed by others or not. So the situation is either public and private, and depending on the situation, you can change your strategy. Okay, so the honest strategy always cooperates with a good guy, but the hypocrite strategy cooperates only with a good guy, only in a public situation. So we tend to think that the hypocrite wins against honest strategy. So here's the social norm. The third order information is replaced by the situation, public or private. But what we did the same. Okay, so here's the method. So I assumed two kinds of situations. One is public situation. Your behavior is always observed. And the second is private situation. Your behavior is sometimes observed. But I haven't specified the frequency of each situation. So here's the second parameter, P, that represents the frequency of public situation and also the private situation. So remember, P is the frequency of public situation, and 1 minus P is the frequency of private situation. Okay? Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'll skip some slides, but what I did is exactly the same as what I have done for the leading 8. Okay, so the key important message is here. Okay, So we find which ESS is the most cooperative, and I find a quite wide region where the honest strategy wins. That may be counterintuitive because hypocrite can take advantage of the private interaction. So why? Well, I have two explanations. Because the region is like this. The region is like this. So what's happening in the top region? The top region is when Q is high. That means Q being high means even if you are in a private situation, the observability is still high, so you should be better off to cooperate. That makes sense. That's not surprising. But what is surprising is the left bottom corner of this figure. Left bottom corner of this figure. The left bottom corner means that Q is low, quite low, so you're not observed by others. Chance for cheating? But still, P is low. P is the frequency of public interaction. What this means? Well, so P is low, so almost all interactions are private, and Q is low. That private interactions is rarely seen by others. So most interactions are not seen by others in that setting. So that has some counter effect. If your interaction is rarely seen, once you lose your good reputation, it takes very much long time for you to recover that reputation because you have to be observed by others. So you have to signal and you have to stand up. I'm doing good thing, but you're neglected for a long time. So defecting, cheating is quite a risky behavior here. Although we haven't studied it experimentally, but I hope that in future we can test those hypotheses. So I'm wrapping up my talk. There are a lot of fruits after blossom of social norms. Firstly, evolutionary anthropologists are quite interested in the origin of evolution of cooperation. And as I showed, there is quite rich interaction between social studies, humanity studies, for example, the social psychology and an experimental and behavioral economists. I very much like this kind of interaction. So it's not only biology field, but also other fields. And also, this result can be used social design. For example, e-commerce, for example, internet auction. And if you sell something or if you buy something, you can evaluate others. This kind of system can be improved if we study indirect reciprocity very much. So I thank wonderful collaborators and the funding body, and thank you very much for your listening.
So thank you very much for this fascinating talk. And we have time for just one or two quick questions, I'm afraid. Yeah, one there.
Thank you for the inspiring talk. Could you please comment, you have already talked about different opinions of people. Could you please comment more on people with maybe population with different social norms, say two populations of races or with different social norms, when they immigrate into one place and start to live together, how these social norms competing against each other?
That's a fascinating question. Actually, I mentioned very little about this possibility, and almost all my studies based on the fact that a society uses only one social norm. But your point makes very much sense. For example, you have a competition between two groups that adopt different social norms. And I guess sometime in this situation, the group selection thing, or maybe a movement between groups occurred according to the group payoff. So you have, for example, a quite uncooperative group, and you have a cooperative group, and they use different social norms, and they use different action rules in those populations. And if you are likely to move to the cooperative population because you can be better off there, then that somehow selects for cooperative society. So this kind of idea is behind my analysis. And the other important point is the competition between two social or multiple social norms inside one population. And actually, I haven't done so much, but a fantastic job has been done by other researchers. about the competition between two social norms. But I can say very little about this possibility. But the point, one of the difficulty when we talk about the competition between two social norms is, let's suppose that I'm in A side and the others are on B side, and they use different social norms. In that case, the majority effect, the positive frequency dependence occurs, because if the majority of us believes this behavior is good and this behavior is bad, whereas the minority of people thinks this behavior is this behavior is not good, but this behavior should be good, then the minority always loses, because in the eyes of majority, minorities are doing something quite wrong and they cannot receive cooperation from the group of majority. In that case, the majority always wins, so there are a lot of equilibria in that system, and probably a future study will reveal this kind of competition between social norms. But thank you very much for an exciting question.
One last question.
So I have a question regarding feedback. So if I do something in a society, and I learn and I change my action rules,
Mm-hmm.
and so it could be possible that if the people are learning,
Mm-hmm.
that they all go to one set of action rules, or that different action rules could compete. Can you say something about this?
Okay. Well, my model, although I said evolutionary model, includes the genetic and the cultural component. So learning is actually included in my model. And when we talk about the genetic evolution, the fitness difference matters, but here the payoff difference matters. And I'm not sure perfectly whether this is completely driven by genetic or cultural component. But if you assume the cultural evolution, then the quite standard scenario is that you mimic the person who has a better, larger payoff than others. So yes, my model includes a learning component. And about the coexistence thing, yes, I have only paid attention to the equilibrium. So equilibrium means everybody uses the same strategy. But actually, if we do some more analysis, that we can sometimes find a polymorphic state where the different strategies are coexisting. But well, I would say that this kind of possibility was a little bit out of scope, my analysis.
So let's thank the speaker once more.